Welcome to the Femisplainers. I'm Christina Hoff-Summers.
And I'm Danielle Crittenden. And this is our season finale, holiday special. Couple more days till Christmas. Hello, happy holidays. Merry Christmas, everybody. Happy Hanukkah.
And Festivus. It's Festivus.
It's Festivus.
That's the only holiday I totally resonate with. But
you know, there is a war on Festivus.
I know it. It's very distressing. It's un-American, and
I am going to say happy Festivus.
oh, thank you.
Thank you. So it is. It's almost like, okay, so let's admit it. We're Jews. We're kind of Jews. And the Goyim are all celebrating. And we're supposed to be kind of unhappy.
You know what? We're the happiest people in America.
We are. We love
Goyim,
Christmas.
They get depressed. They get overwhelmed.
Stressed.
And they overindulge.
Well, we do too, but we don't have to worry about being with all our relatives. We did that at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. Can we just say it? Nobody's listening, right? Jews created Christmas.
Yeah.
The modern Christmas. Who wrote all... In fact, my daughter B was in school and some girl said, can you sing any Hanukkah songs and besides dreidel? And then she started to sing White Christmas.
Yeah.
And like Irving Berlin. Hey, who wrote your best Christmas songs, people? Jews.
Yeah.
So
whose birthday was it? A Jew.
You're welcome. But no, this is actually serious. People get very, very depressed, and we can't help out our Goyim friends because they are under the pressure of the year and all the presents and things, whereas we get to eat latkes and
go for Chinese food.
We are literally going for Chinese food on New Year's Eve with my Goyish mother, who is here, and we're going to, that's what we do, and we love it. But here's where Jews get sad, to be fair. Like, it is Hanukkah, and North America, Hanukkah is like a nothing holiday in the Jewish calendar compared to the high holy days and Rosh Hashanah and Passover and stuff. But we're always complaining that we're made to feel like, oh, we can't indulge in the holiday spirit. And you go to CVS or Target, and there are these sad little corners. They're like
with blue,
decoration
white
ghettos, and
yeah.
they have like crappy little plastic dreidels and things. And Jews go, oh,
that's what we get.
That's what we get. And
then you tell your kids, oh, you get a present every day. But somehow they know.
Yeah, they just feel like it's not good. So here's what I did because
the New York Times.
I know. I was in the New York Times.
They actually wrote to me, how can we reach your co-splainer, Danielle? Because we want to hear what she has to say about Hanukkah. So she's the Martha Stewart of Judaism.
Well, this is in my previous life, in one of my many previous lives, before we did this podcast. I tried and failed to run a website. It wasn't just a website. It was an e-commerce site that sourced beautiful artisanal Judaica from all over the world. And I did recipes and I did travel and all kinds of things. But one of the reasons...
Big Tree and Vine, it was so beautiful.
Yeah, it's gone now. But anyway, one of the things I was trying to do is like, hey, this doesn't have to be so depressing. And I remember when my kids were little, and they did, to be fair, they got Christmas with my parents because I'm a convert. So they weren't really deprived of Christmas.
She's a convert. She went from being
an
anti-Semite to a self-loathing Jew.
But the kids, when they were little, they say like, but why can't we decorate our house? We have to go to grandma's. And we were, as with their dad, like, no, we're Jewish. We don't do that. We don't have a tree. And then one day my son, Nat, who was maybe 7, he said, Dad, it's a festival of lights. So why can't we have lights? And David said, you've got me there. And that kind of unleashed a monster within me.
All right. Well, so
you've seen it.
Husband, who was formerly an Orthodox Jew, but not anymore, he still felt guilty, and he would not have said, you got me there. He would have had like 11 reasons why.
Okay, but I'll tell you what happened, because we have a modern Orthodox Rabbi Shmuel.
Rabbi Shmuel.
So first of all, okay, so I got lights, blue and white lights, Hanukkah theme. And then I started to work on Hanukkah wreaths because think about it. All of this greenery around Christmas is pagan. It goes back to Druidic origin. Christmas trees are not Christian. There is nothing about any of this festives. I mean, it's become associated with Christianity. So Jews don't want to adopt it because they feel it looks too Christian.
But there's a lot of Celtic paganism.
There's so much of that stuff. And going back to Roman times too, which is so the first year I took some coat hangers. Fred would have been proud of this, I have to admit, my ingenuity with coat hangers and paper clips.
He would have liked that. That man could fix anything. Paper clips and super glue, including teeth.
So I made a Star of David out of wire. And then I fashioned, because think about it, pine, cedar, trees of the Holy Land, right? Fashioned a Star of David and then put lights. And then I found little ornaments like bagels, pickles, and I hung them from the star. And that was on our door. So that was my first year. Then I got more ambitious and I started... Well, you've seen our house now. There are lights everywhere. You can have beautiful menorahs. You can
and just blue and white lights everywhere,
and silver, and so we now and my rabbi said, okay, this was funny. When I first said, is this okay? He's going yeah, totally, because he wants Jews to feel included, and there's no reason we should feel excluded. It's a North American thing.
We can have lights. And it's all about lights.
Well, now my rabbi in his neighborhood, he puts out huge inflatable dreidels. How some people put inflatable Santa. So he puts out the biggest dreidels, and he competes with his Christian neighbors to have the best lit house. So anyway, so that's what we do. So I say to you, Jews, don't be sad. No sad Jews this holiday. You can have...
I'm more worried about the sad, Goyim. I mean, really...
Yeah.
And as you get older, you remember Christmas is past and you get sad and all of that.
Well, as often, they're very traumatizing. We had a couple friends who shall go unnamed, Christian friends, over for dinner. We were all together. And they were telling us how stressed and depressed they get at this time of year.
I remember one Christmas celebration at a friend's house. There was violent little children unwrapping their presents and not it was just the worst kind of consumer overload. Kids, everything it could make you a Marxist revolutionary just watching these kids
unwrapped in 10 seconds.
My brother, this was a long time ago, this was in the 70s, he just needed a cigarette. And then my aunt rushed over and said, "Don't have a cigarette, there's so much wrapping." And my brother looked at me and said, "The one little pleasure life allows, and I can't even have that." So that sort of summed up the evening.
Right. And our friends were talking about it. They had parents who were alcoholics or tensions, and then one mother who was
Dads
there.
who tore down the Christmas tree. I had some friend who told me that
oh no, she said
kids kept knocking over the tree, and then to punish them, the dad set it on fire,
Well, or no, our friend who was there that night was talking about the tree that got too high. They bought too big a tree. So he came and with gardening shears clipped the top of it off so it had this truncated tree. And they weren't allowed to laugh. That was the other thing. You couldn't just make it, oh, that's a family now funny joke, legend. The year Dad had to lop the top of the tree, making it look weird. It was very serious. Well, my late stepfather told a story of his father, who was this very serious general who hated Christmas. He had been an orphan, Oh,
orphans hate Christmas.
And just didn't understand the fuss, and everybody got tense on Christmas Day, and the pressure on his, the mothers to produce the turkey and all the presents, and they were sitting down. By the time they sat down to dinner, everybody is just in a foul mood and bickering, and he starts carving the turkey, and he looks up at the table and he goes, "God damn it, it's Christmas. Be happy." So we're out there. We sympathize with you, and we urge our Goyish friends to come join us for Chinese food, and then what I call schnoring, the Christmas schnoring, which we
snore.
We
go
snore.
to the homes of Christians and
who have beautiful
drink
trees.
in the beauty, because we do kind of envy the Christmas trees
and listen to
carols,
this and listen to the
gingerbread
music.
houses, the music,
And our friend who served Manhattans by the tree.
Manhattans. Those were like Kir Royale Plus.
Yeah.
They were pink Manhattans. They were beautiful.
And I call this Christmas schnoring. Schnoring is a Yiddish word for
Leeching.
that person who shows up and eats all the food at the buffet because it's free. So I call myself a Christmas schnorer. Rhymes with menorah.
But I'm coming to your house with my son David.
That's right. We're going to have Christmas
and we're
together.
gonna play categories or celebrities.
Celebrity.
Later we'll tell
we've
you how to play
discussed
the
it.
game.
No, we already have. We told them this for Thanksgiving.
Oh, sorry.
So we're going to do it again. But okay. But this season finale, we have an amazing guest. It is Ambassador Susan Rice, who is the author of Tough Love, My Story and the Things Worth Fighting For.
And I know what you're thinking. Oh, former political official and wrote a book. I don't want to read it. You want to read it. She's honest. She's funny. And she's so brave.
Right. Well, you probably have formed maybe just as we had, superficial views. She was the former National Security Advisor and Ambassador to the UN under President Obama. She was an Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under President Clinton in his second term. But she got the youngest. She was so young when she got appointed this. And people have, as you do with political figures, you have like a it's kind of
Yeah.
And she was very. She always seemed very distant. She was a kind of distant person. You never
Very
really
competent and responsible, but formal.
right, and you didn't know her. And then she got sort of pilloried through these Benghazi and various crises.
Endless about something she was peripheral, really, in terms of the decision making.
Right, but nonetheless, this is the the impression that you have of her. And then you think when her book came in, I thought, it's a political book. It's going to be boring. We both sort of looked at
I
it.
fell in love with her.
Well, after reading it, it's an
I love her.
amazing book.
And now that I've talked to her, I want her to run for president. It's killing me that she's not up on the stage with people who are, just not quite her level.
Well, that's the thing. The book was fascinating. It was
She's
very
the real
candid.
thing.
Her childhood and background, and yet she grew up in Washington. Very super, almost frighteningly accomplished. She's 1 year younger than I am. I feel like a failure. Like you just read that book.
I'm kind of in love with her son, Jake, as well, who she's a centrist Democrat, but her son, Jake, is at Stanford and became president of the Young Republicans.
And invited you to speak. And
Well, he didn't invite me, but he was among a group. I was there with Andrew Sullivan and Neil Ferguson to talk about free speech, and it was his group that invited us.
right, but I love seeing when you meet somebody who is sort of this famous and yet also this unknown, really. She's kind of Sphinx-like. And getting to know her both through this very interesting book and then getting to meet her in person. And she drinks red wine.
She likes red wine.
Which we've got handy. I brought a bottle called Pursuit, which I thought was appropriate.
Because what I want now, having talked to her, what I want is her to take your rest, get your kids through school, but then come back and save us from ourselves.
Right, and they're not going to believe us till they hear her. So let's bring her on. She's going to be in studio, and
There we go.
here we go. Well, Christina, you know how you and I guess we could be called lamp or lighting fanatics, that you've admitted on this podcast into actually changing light bulbs in hotel rooms because you didn't like.
Or just turning them off completely. I can't bear this harsh light that you get from these, what are they called? These, I don't know.
The hotel, but also I have like dimmers on all my. I consider
dimmers on
lighting
everything.
so key.
Yeah, dimmers
to everything,
yeah.
to mood, to how we look, and with all the money we spend to make our homes beautiful. Often we don't put enough thought into good lighting, but Lamps Plus has been helping customers love their everyday spaces for over 40 years with chandeliers, ceiling lights, table lamps, and more. As they say, light itself is like jewelry for the home. I guess that's why you have pink bulbs.
I always use pink bulbs.
In any
Looks
case,
like candlelight.
it does look like candlelight, and these are like beautiful candle holders. Lamps Plus is the nation's largest lighting retailer with over 55,000 designs from top brands and their own exclusive designs in lighting, home furnishings, and decor. They also have a large selection of Minka Lavery lighting to transform your home into wonderful living areas. Minka Lavery is known for designs that blend function and style using innovative materials. And now, with people coming for the holidays and you want to spruce your house up, you can get up to 50% off hundreds of lights, furniture, and decor up through December 24th. That's up to 50% off during the Lamps Plus holiday sale now through December 24th. You go to Lamps Plus, that's Lamps plural, LAMPS plus.com/ and use the code FEMSPLAIN to start saving today. That's lampsplus.com/FEMSPLAIN.
Go to lampsplus.com/femsplain to start saving today. lampsplus.com/femsplain.
Jewelry for your home.
Well, Ambassador Rice, welcome to the Femsplainers.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you both.
Yes, thank you for coming. We're so excited to have you. We really love the book, and I love the title because tough love really was the theme of the whole book, but also in a very personal way, especially with your family background. And I found the early chapters about where your family came from, and its roots in Maine and also segregated South, and yet they managed to produce such extraordinary kids, each from very humble roots, your uncles, your mother. So why don't you talk a little bit about that and that background and what produced this phrase, tough love, that became the theme of the book?
Well, tough love to me means loving fiercely but not uncritically. And the surest sign of somebody who really loves you and has your best interest at heart is somebody who's willing to tell you the hard truths and when you might not want to hear them. And that's really how my parents, who, as you said, came from very different backgrounds, but were both quite accomplished people, raised me and my younger brother, John. And it's also, frankly, how my husband Ian and I have tried to raise our kids, to know that we're there for them in their corner, but we're going to give them, some pretty unvarnished feedback when that's deserved. It's also how I benefited from mentors in my career who were willing to help me course correct when I needed it. And it's also how I tried to lead my own teams in government. And ultimately, also, it was a phrase that embodied how I tried to serve our country. I mean, I love this country fiercely. I think it's amazing. But I also think we are capable historically and in the present and undoubtedly in the future of making mistakes. And we need to be willing to acknowledge those and try to learn from them and build on them.
Well, go back to that, especially your grandparents in Maine, because, Christina and I are both parents. What I was impressed, like your grandfather, both your mother and grandfather came on your mother's side, came from Jamaica. And your grandfather had originally been a cobbler and then injured his hand, and he became a janitor. And then your mother was a seamstress.
Grandmother, yes.
Grandmother, I'm sorry, and laundress.
Went to Radcliffe.
No, but that was the thing. So they had 4 boys and 1 girl.
Yeah.
And these humble black couple living in Maine, which is not known for its enormous black population.
No, and especially not then.
And,
so, yeah.
Tell us about that. And then they have these incredible high-achieving children, which comes from this concept, I think, of tough love.
Well, my grandparents on my mother's side, Mary and David Dixon, really were extraordinary. They came to Maine in 1912 from Jamaica as, just the traditional immigrant experience. They were unskilled. They were relatively uneducated. Neither of them finished high school. And they came to the United States to try to build a better future for what would become their family. They got married on Christmas Day in the Episcopal Cathedral in Portland, Maine, and they ended up having 5 kids. My mother was the youngest, and her 4 older brothers were expected to work hard and excel, and they did. My grandfather was the first man to have 4 sons attend Bowdoin College in Maine, and 2 of my uncles became doctors, one a optometrist, and the 4th an English literature professor and a university president. And then along came my mother, the only girl, 11 years younger than her youngest brother. And she was a high school valedictorian at Portland High School. She was a national champion debater. She was a pianist and, student body president. She was just, off the charts in an environment where obviously there were very, very few people of color. She couldn't go to Bowdoin because she was a woman, and it was 1950. And so she heard this place called Radcliffe because one of her brothers had gotten his PhD at Harvard in English literature. And so she got in, and she was all set to go. But the scholarship that she was entitled to as valedictorian of her high school class from the state of Maine's Radcliffe Alumni Committee was denied to her because she was black. And my grandfather had about 18 months before had a catastrophic accident where he was a janitor in this music store. He fell down an elevator shaft and broke his back and broke his legs. And so he was in the hospital for almost a year, and all their savings were sapped. So this scholarship was absolutely critical. And they didn't give it to her because the so-called criteria for the scholarship included somebody who could come back from Radcliffe and move in, quote, the proper circles in Maine to raise money for the college. And because my mother was black, it was determined she couldn't move in the proper circles, so therefore she wasn't going to get the scholarship.
Argument Harvard used for not taking Jews.
Yeah, of course. But this wasn't actually, in fairness, this wasn't Harvard. This was the state of Maine committee. And so my mother's high school principal appealed to Harvard, to Radcliffe at the time, to give her the money she needed, and they did. So she was able to go because of that. And so she made her life's work in various different capacities about expanding opportunity for low-income Americans, enabling them to attend colleges and universities. She ended up later in her career being a corporate executive and sitting on 11 publicly traded corporate boards, but the bulk of her career was about higher education finance, and she was known as the mother of the Pell Grant, which has helped 80 million Americans reach college. So that's my mother's side of the family. So a commitment to education and to service and to betterment of the community and to lifting up others. And my father, who came from a very different background, had a similar set of principles and values that guided him. He came, as you mentioned, from segregated South Carolina. He was born around 1920. He was the grandson of a slave who had fought in the Union Army after emancipation. And he met an officer, a white officer from Massachusetts in the regiment in South Carolina, who encouraged him to come up to Massachusetts and get a primary education after the war ended. He did that. He went back to South Carolina, was primary school teacher, and then was driven out of South Carolina by the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. He fled to the north to New Jersey. He got his bachelor's degree, a divinity degree, at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. For a slave at that time to have a college education was extraordinary. And he went on to found a school in New Jersey called the Bordentown School, which for 70 years, from the late 1880s until the 1950s, educated generations of African Americans, both in vocational and technical skills, but also in college preparatory skills. And this school welcomed to the campus people like Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Mary McLeod Bethune. It was an extraordinary institution. And so My father's side of the family had, again, this tradition of education. My great-grandfather, my grandfather were Methodist ministers and college educated. And along comes my dad in 1920 into a situation where Jim Crow was at its height and lynching was ravaging the South. And he had talent, he had ambition, he had a legacy of education, and yet many, many doors were closed to him, particularly in the South. He ended up getting his college degree and his MBA in New York at City College, and then was drafted into World War II and served with the Tuskegee Airmen in Tuskegee, Alabama. And that experience was extraordinarily formative for him. He was proud to serve among a very elite group of servicemen who distinguished themselves in combat and as pilots, but he resented mightily the notion that they had to prove to white people that they could fly or fight as well as anybody. And he resented also that he was expected to fight for freedom for everybody but his own people. Mm-hmm. And so he had, from an early age, a lot of baggage associated with racism in this country. After the war, he went to Berkeley and got his PhD in economics at the University of California. He was a Fulbright scholar in India, and he became a professor of economics at Cornell and worked at the Treasury Department and the World Bank, and ultimately was a governor of the Federal Reserve. But he had to really fight his way through a lot of barriers to rise in his field at a time when there were very, very few African-American PhDs in economics. When he left Berkeley, he couldn't get a job on the West Coast in the private sector or academia. And the only way he got this job, his first job out of university at Cornell, was because his professors at Berkeley recommended him but didn't tell Cornell he was black. And so he arrived on campus, and they were like, "Wait a minute!" But they didn't send it back. And he did very well, and that was sort of how things began to open up for him. But he really, both my parents had very interesting experiences with racism and prejudice. But what they taught me and my brother from a very early age was we can't let other people's bigotry and prejudice become our own self-definition. We had to believe in ourselves and know our capacities, do our best, and develop a sort of psychological armor that allowed us to recognize that if somebody is prejudiced towards me because of my race or my gender, or whatever, that in all likelihood that bigotry is a result of their own insecurity. And so as the recipient of the bigotry, you want to avoid letting that insecurity become yours.
Define you.
Yeah. And so that's a sort of psychological jujitsu that my father learned after many hard knocks, sort of midway through his career. But he taught me and my brother from an early age to build those mental muscles so that we had a strong belief in our own abilities and capacities, and we didn't let other people bully us or define us. My dad had a famous expression that I repeat a lot in Tough Love, and that was, don't take crap off of anybody, meaning don't let anybody diss you or dismiss you or bully you. Don't start an argument, but if they are pushing you around, you have to push back. You've got to stand up for yourself.
When you were in school, high school, junior high, sort of, did your parents really push you, or did you have like tiger parents, or was it more like?
No, they weren't tiger parents. It was really interesting as a parent looking back on it in retrospect. The expectations were high, and there was no sympathy for slacking. But nobody said you've got to be X or you got to be Y, you got to do this or you can't do that, and they weren't.
They weren't
riding us.
Parent.
They weren't riding us. But what my parents always said to me is always do your best, and your best will be good enough, by which they meant not that you'll be great at everything you set out to do, but we will be fine with your performance, whether it's great or not so great, if you've really given it, whatever it is, your best shot. But don't slack.
You were probably a straight A student?
Not initially.
No.
I was high school valedictorian ultimately, so I did get, I got to a point in 9th or 10th grade where I really was doing well academically. But I, as I write in the book, my parents, as wonderful as they each were, had no business being married. And they went through a really ugly, violent, painful divorce and then public custody battle, which extended many years through my childhood. So as I was trying to deal with that and, figure out how to cope both academically and with my friends and all of those things, I think my academics suffered, and I didn't really have confidence that I could be as strong a student as I turned out to be. And I write in the book how one of my many influential teachers at my high school, National Cathedral School, helped me. But I had a 7th grade teacher who was a legend at National Cathedral School. She taught medieval history, and she was both eccentric and very tough and unforgiving in terms of high standards. And she took me aside after the end of my 7th grade year and in a private conversation, totally to my surprise, said to me, you're a good student and you can be a great student. If you work really hard and put your mind to it, I think you can win the flag, which, Danielle, as you know, is the equivalent
Our daughter goes to NCS, so I know how tough it is. I know how
winning the flag
really
is literally the American flag that flies adjacent to the cathedral, but it's what they award the valedictorian as the prize. And so I was totally taken aback by that. At 7th grade, I didn't think that was possible, and I was shocked that this tough teacher thought that was something that was potentially within my reach. But I put that sort of in the back of my head, and it was motivation as I became, a high school student. I said, well, if Mrs. Williamson thinks I might be able to do this, maybe I can.
It's incredible the influence those strategic teachers at different times in our lives can have. Well, you wrote so candidly about your parents' marriage, and it was wrenching to read because you were, I think, all of the age of 7. And as children in households where turmoil is going on or alcoholism or something, those children can take on roles. And you took on the role as like peace negotiator with your parents. You would sit with them, and I suspect this served you well later in life in your career, but it was just a wrenching thing to read that here is a 7-year-old sitting down with her parents and trying to come to some sort of accord, Palestinian-Israeli accord within your own household.
I've joked that I'd rather be negotiating with the Russians or the Chinese than my parents.
Exactly.
But it's funny. This is one of those things that I really hadn't processed until I had the opportunity to write the book. And there were a lot of reasons why I wanted to, but one of which was to really finally slow down and step back and think about all of the extraordinary influences on my life, positive and negative, and what I learned from them, and to take the time to process some of these wounds that I had sort of sped through as a child in order to cope and in order to excel. I never really had the emotional and psychological time and space to really think about, how all these experiences shaped me. And so I did realize, with the benefit of hindsight, that, at a very early age, I was a firefighter in a household that was violent and scary, trying to sometimes physically separate my parents, but more often to intervene when I thought something might get out of control and try to, diffuse it by talking them down. And what is your perspective? What is your perspective? Why are you fighting about this? Does this really make sense? As a 7 and 8-year-old, and maybe I realized as I was looking back that experience not only taught me, how to handle conflict, but also not to fear running into the fray and embracing what I think has been sort of my tacit instinct throughout life, which is to try to help resolve conflict, but also not being afraid of it myself. I mean, if somebody's coming at me, I'm not afraid to stand my ground and, if necessary, fight back. And it also taught me resilience. I mean, the most important thing I think that I learned from my parents' divorce and custody battle was I couldn't keep them from fighting and I couldn't make them reconcile, but I did have some control over myself. And, when my friendships were suffering because I was angry and acting out, or my academics weren't ideal, those were things that were within my capacity to address. And so I learned resilience, and I learned that I could take a hit and keep running. And that gave me a lot of confidence in a sort of backhanded way.
What was it like growing up in D.C.? Most of the people I meet in D.C. are from somewhere else. Just you and Ann Applebaum are the only people I know.
And Ann was my contemporary.
You're right. She said
we were in high school together.
You played basketball or lacrosse?
I think it was field
No,
hockey.
basketball. She may have played field hockey, but we both played basketball.
Right.
She was at Sidwell.
Right.
I was at National Cathedral. We were the same year, and we were at Stanford together.
Right, and she said she has this memory of you being this terrifying person coming down the court at her that you were, as you admit, you were super competitive. But you also, despite the turmoil in your home, you were with these parents who were otherwise very much part of, I guess you would call it, an establishment, the sort of black elite establishment. Is that a correct, but very connected? I mean,
well, let me put it differently, and you all will understand being from here, or not being from here, but living here.
Yeah.
Despite my grandparents, coming on both sides from relatively modest backgrounds, and my parents having to, really work to establish themselves professionally, by the time my brother and I came along in the mid-'60s, parents were solidly middle class. My dad was a government employee. My mother worked for a nonprofit organization. And even though they weren't wealthy at that time, they had enough to send us to the cathedral schools here. These are, as you know, some of the best schools in the city. And I was blessed to, not only get a great education, but I was one of a small number of African American students in these predominantly white elite schools. And you asked what it was like growing up in Washington. My friends and classmates were the sons and daughters of senators and members of Congress and ambassadors. I had friends whose parents went to jail for Watergate.
Ooh.
And
you also grew up, there were as you recall, being a young girl, walking through the streets where there was, Washington Stages was literally on fire. I mean, we think of it as on fire now.
Different kind of fire. I didn't walk through. My parents took me through. My parents were determined that my brother and I see the city, our country, the world in all of its complexity. So the television set was always on for the nightly news, and it was Vietnam, and it was Watergate, and it was the Civil Rights era. And my mother sat me down when I was 4 years old to watch Robert Kennedy's casket come on the train from New York to Washington, which I'll never forget. And when Washington, D.C. and the 14th Street corridor burnt down because of the riots after Dr. King's assassination, when things calmed down, my parents took me and my brother in a stroller to just see what had happened. They took us to the mall for the Poor People's Campaign in the mud to experience what was going on. So I had these parents who were extraordinarily committed to us understanding what was going on around us. I had classmates and contemporaries in school whose family business was that of government and politics. And some of my this was back in the time when members of Congress lived in Washington.
Right.
And they brought their families to Washington. And we grew up together.
For the week
and they got
vanished
along.
For the
You had friends across
That's
party
right. Many of my closest friends, and one family in particular, one of my dearest friends to this day, very committed Republicans. Her father was a Republican senator from Tennessee. He was later Reagan's Secretary of Labor and the chairman of the Republican National Committee. But they were family to me and still are. And so I grew up in this very bipartisan environment, very policy-oriented environment, and that shaped my interest in service, my interest in government, and it was the whole milieu. So it really shaped me in a profound way, and I believed in, and I recall with great remorse, the loss of that bipartisan Washington. I mean, it's not that people didn't disagree, but when families know each other, when fathers are playing golf together on the weekend, and and the kids are hanging out across, because they make friends, not because you pick your friends on the basis of partisan affiliation. It means you know each other as human beings, and it makes a whole lot of everything, including policy differences.
It's harder to demonize when you know the humanity of the person.
And when you have to come back and see them in your personal life.
Well, speaking of that, you have a son who has strayed.
So to speak.
Now, to be honest, he is
he's a
conservative at Stanford, so he may have been, I spoke there recently, and it may have been his group that invited me.
It might have been.
But how does that work? And any advice to families that have...
Well, can I just throw in a modifier to that? No, because I'm listening. When I was reading your book, I'm thinking, these, forgive me, your tough-ass grandparents, and you're just going to go to college and appreciate education, and all of these kids listening to their parents, and I'm thinking, I tried to be tough with my children, and
they didn't listen.
Well, but I don't mean being tough all the time, but we raised our kids to believe in themselves, to have the courage of their own convictions,
right,
and not to be shy.
And now your son
and now
has
we're
the
reaping.
courage.
Now we're reaping the benefits.
I would love
of that.
to be a fly on the wall and hear.
Oh my God! Well, so we've got two kids. The eldest is Jake, who is now senior.
Hey,
Jake. He's now senior at Stanford, and he was for a good period of time the president of Stanford College Republicans. And he grew the organization from a shrunken, shriveled up core into something quite vibrant. And I'm proud of him for that.
You're proud of that.
And our daughter, who is an 11th grader, is very, very progressive. And her dad and I are, pragmatic progressives in the middle. And when they were all at the dinner table together, which of course we are now because he's home from college,
right?
It's a thing sometimes. And but look, I've loved these kids. They're wonderful. They're smart. They're committed. We all are very close as a family. But my son and I and my husband, we all differ with Jake. It's like 3-1.
He's the Alex B. Keaton of your
He is, but what's so interesting is my progressive daughter, who's very thoughtful and mild-mannered and open-minded. She's the one who is most insistent that we be patient with Jake and be patient with differing perspectives. So I'll give you just a tiny little anecdote. The impeachment vote yesterday. I just all day long, I was so frustrated that every TV channel I turned on, every radio station, we had to listen to this endless debate, and I feel like I've heard it, right?
Right.
I just couldn't.
The points didn't change.
I just couldn't take it. And Jake was listening to it most of the day, being home from college. And I finally sent him downstairs where it wouldn't be in the background. And at dinner time, which coincided with the approach of the vote, Jake said, we really ought to watch the vote together. And I'm like, why do we have to watch the vote? And my daughter says, Mom, this is historic. We got to watch the vote. You talk in your book how your parents took you to see all these historic things. This is historic. We got to watch it. And my husband agrees, so I'm outvoted. And we're having to listen to the last few speakers, who included some that I really had a hard time to.
Pilot and the betrayal of...
But, this was a moment where, without rancor, we sat together and watched something that we obviously didn't agree on quite
So your
dramatically.
son was upset by the impeachment? Or...
No, he definitely disagrees with it.
Yeah.
He wasn't sufficiently upset by it, which upset me. My vantage point was, this is very sober, very serious. This is not something that, from my perspective as a Democrat, and I think from the perspective of the Democratic leadership, any of us wanted to see. It's not probably good politically.
Yeah.
And yet, from his point of view, it's all about politics. And I was trying to explain, if given a choice, had the Ukraine thing not happened, there's no way
this would have happened.
Speaker Pelosi would have gone down this road.
Yeah.
And this is about principle, but we don't agree on that. But I love my son, Jake. He's a good kid. We're very close. We disagree, and we try to work it through. You asked, how do we manage? Well, one, by not trying to talk about it all the time, having other things to talk about, but also being willing to confront it when it needs to be confronted and to talk about where we differ and to try to find areas of common ground. We actually agree on more than most people would suspect, and I actually try to explain in the book toward the end, where we agree, where we disagree. We agree more on international stuff, actually, than domestic. We agree on many of the objectives, but differ on the means. And we've found ways to talk about it in a more dispassionate way. But we also, I'll confess, have our moments of rather robust argument.
Well, my son I was a philosophy professor, and so was my husband, and our son is a philosophy professor. And he's become very, well, I don't want to say he'll resent this, but very liberal. More than is necessary. And we have these encounters after Thanksgiving, he has a philosophy podcast, Very Bad Wizards, and we fight and bicker, but people can tell we just love each other, and it's ultimately, and we've been overserved during this debate, so it doesn't add up to anything. But what I do think you might agree with your son Jake on, and boy, am I with you on this, Jake, is the move in the academy, especially this style of feminism, and I think you find it in the civil rights movement too, towards safe spaces and trigger warning and this sort of culture of fragility. It seems so much the opposite of the spirit of your book and the message of your parents. And what do you agree with what I presume Jake thinks about that?
I think we do substantially agree. I mean, and by the way, I don't think this is a liberal-conservative divide.
No, actually, it's on both sides. And
I'm a big believer in free speech and a big believer in robust debate and dialogue. And I think you go to university to learn. And you can't learn if everything you hear reinforces the preconceived notions you had when you got there. And so in the last chapter of Tough Love, which is called Bridging the Divide, which is about our domestic political divisions and their evolution and what we have to do about it, I argue that it's really important that well before college, we return to educating our young people about civics, about our Constitution, about the separation of powers and the fundamentals that undergird our democracy. And I also argue that, when we get to universities, it is not wise or healthy to encourage students or faculty to be unwilling to engage in debate. And I don't believe in trigger warnings. I don't believe in shutting up left-leaning organizations or right-leaning organizations on campus. I think they all need to be there and be able to thrive and to bring voices to campus that may be troubling, if not offensive, to certain segments of the student body or the faculty. So, and that's one of the things that Jake has done at Stanford. He has been more active in bringing conservative voices to campus, and all of whom, frankly, I disagree with, some more violently than others. But I think that's appropriate. I don't think that, we can label students on the left as socialist and as SGWs, social justice warriors, and all these pejoratives and call them anti-Semitic any more than we can, disparage conservative perspectives and deny their right and responsibility to be heard. So I'm personally a very strong believer that, we need to be willing and able to engage opinion with which we differ.
I wish you were running for president.
Well,
And she may be. That's our last question, Christina.
No, I love what she said.
Well, you've been you have personally been through many ringers. I was going to say the ringer, but you've been through many ringers, and this goes to your family that you had a mother who worked throughout your childhood.
by choice.
Yeah, and by choice, right? Yeah. Your grandmother had to work when especially when her husband was injured, but your mother worked and did, and not just worked, but really.
She was a very accomplished professional.
She was accomplished, but with a purpose, with a mission,
Yes.
Going into that spirit of your family. Like, you don't just take a job, you go to do something and do ideally good. And so you took on these very demanding roles. And you describe actually in the opening of the book that, your daughter at one point, you got vilified. And we don't have to go into it, but I'm happy if you want to.
It's still inexplicable, the whole thing.
But you got, sort of vilified after the Benghazi stuff. And your daughter at home started to have hallucinations. You were...
Well, because they thought that she was ill. It was something was wrong with her.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be stress over the way that you were this target of so much.
So talk a little bit about that balancing. I mean, we talk about how do you balance family with work? But this is how do you
people
balance
don't realize
being...
that they're human beings,
right?
And they have families. And I think about
that's why I included
thing that
it.
happened to you.
So, many of them will recall. I went on the 5 Sunday shows. I gave the information that was our best current understanding.
3 days, I think, after the horrifying
4 or 5 days
murder
after
in
the
Benghazi.
terrorist
you had
attack.
the CIA talking points.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And they turned out, as I write in the book, in one critical aspect to be in error. And yet it was in the middle of a hot, election campaign. President Obama was running for re-election. And tragically...
It was in 2012.
September 2012.
Right.
And tragically, the loss of our 4 American public servants, including our ambassador, Chris Stevens, became a very hot-button political issue. And so after I went on the shows and I gave this information in one aspect and ultimately turned out to be wrong, I was branded very quickly a liar, incompetent, untrustworthy, blah, blah, blah. And for literally months, I was a fixture on cable television. Most notably on Fox, but also on CNN and MSNBC
well, can I just
and everywhere
say,
else.
you were kind of drafted at the last minute to do those Sunday
Yes.
shows, and you weren't even at that point in the State Department.
No,
You
I
were
was
in
the UN ambassador.
You were an ambassador.
And your mother
told
me
you
should
not to
listen
do
your
this.
mother.
Absolutely.
So
that's the fundamental lesson of the book is listen to your mother. My mother told me I shouldn't go on the shows, and I
And that's
dismissed
because
her.
she sensed, and she had that
Absolutely.
Washington
She had that spidey sense.
Spidey sense.
and do you feel, in retrospect, it was possibly a little bit of a setup to let you take the heat? Or
I don't feel, no, my mother always had the sense that it was a setup. I don't feel I was set up. What I feel like is that I was, unlike my mother who was thinking about me and what was right from my vantage point, she perceived that, it was highly likely in this kind of hot political environment that I would end up in some fashion being a target. I didn't focus on that. I was thinking about, we'd lost our colleagues, the Secretary Clinton and perhaps others who'd been asked by the White House to go on the Sunday shows had declined. I had some sympathy for that because earlier in my career I'd experienced the loss of our American personnel in our embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. I knew how emotionally taxing that was. I was, as sort of is my instinct, was trying to be a team player. The White House asked me to go out. I'd done it many times before. It was 10 days before the opening of the UN General Assembly. It wasn't going to be all on Benghazi. It was on Iran and Prime Minister Netanyahu coming and the demonstrations around the world against our facilities in the Arab and Muslim world because of this horrific video. And I said yes. And my mother was like, that's the wrong answer. But I did it. And of course, my mother turned out to be right. But anyway, the point about my daughter is that after about 6 weeks of this sort of vilification and looping of me on cable television, where frankly, my husband and I made a big mistake not realizing that a 9-year-old kid who was hearing stuff that we were tuning out wasn't able to process it and understand it.
And her mommy was being attacked.
Her mother was being attacked, but so she started having hallucinations. She came to us complaining that she was seeing men coming at her out of walls, and this would happen in classroom at 3rd grade at Beauvoir, or when she went to sleepovers, and we couldn't figure it out. And we took her to Children's Hospital here in Washington, and for weeks they did a battery of tests because
It must have been terrifying.
It was absolutely terrifying. And the most obvious explanations were, brain tumor, psychosis, schizophrenia, vision thing. And they finally ruled all those worst-case scenarios out, thank God. And they concluded sort of by process of elimination that it was in all likelihood a stress reaction to what was happening to me. And as finally, after many months, this faded from view and we figured out to turn off the television, it became less frequent and ultimately went away. She is a very happy, healthy, successful 11th grader right now. And she's fine, thank God. But I included that very personal story with her permission because I did want to make the point, Christina, that you made, that whatever your party, whoever is the target of these attacks, the politics of personal destruction that have become so commonplace in Washington has unintended consequences on innocent people who didn't sign up for this. I might have signed up to be in President Obama's cabinet, but my 9-year-old daughter didn't sign up for the consequences. And I don't believe, because I'm not naive, that by sharing this that anything will change. But I did want to make the point that there are human beings involved here. And, I don't care if you're, on the right or the left, that we need to be mindful of that.
Do you remember she was a Secretary of Energy in the first term of the Clinton administration, Hazel O'Leary?
Of course, yes.
And I always liked her, and she had so much style and pizzazz and finesse, and she made a great impression on me. But she was interviewed. She decided to step down, and she did a lot of good in the energy department, but she faced all sorts of controversies, partly because she spent a lot of money traveling extravagantly and staying in 5-star hotels, which you totally sympathize with.
That's what I do.
Why? How else are you supposed to travel for the government? But anyway, she was interviewed as she was leaving, and she explained why she wanted to go. And then she said, but also, this is all very distressing for my mother. And it just hit me that, I think of my mother, and I wasn't, in headlines or anything, but she would have been so upset. And again, that personal element, that human element, and I am just so just dispirited about this dehumanization, the otherization, and you're just not a person. Yeah. And when you are in public life and it's the other side, it's just...
Well, look, yes, it's horrible. And, the most proximate example, Debbie Dingell.
Oh, my God.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And, how cruel is that?
Yeah, she's referring to another unfortunate tweet.
No, it wasn't a tweet. It was a rally.
It was at the rally.
Oh, it was at the rally.
Michigan.
That's right.
Our home state.
When you're revving them up.
And then he reinforced it, I think, with,
right.
Well, I know I'm misremembering.
But to go back, this toll that, the jobs that you felt that would take a toll on anyone, but especially as a mother, you went on this arduous African trip when you were still nursing your firstborn. And then there's your husband Ian, who I really want to talk about before this goes.
Isn't your mother-in-law? Isn't she?
Oh, I wanted to. Yeah, we have a very.
Yes.
You have a
odd,
Canadian link.
Deeply personal.
Danielle's going to exploit.
Okay, so you have to. I can set up that my late mother-in-law was a very remarkable person, and she was a very famous person in Canada as their nightly news. It's hard to describe to Americans. It's
the Barbara Walters of Canada.
Yeah.
No.
Or more.
She was more like the Walter Cronkite.
Yeah.
Right.
Canada.
That's correct.
That's right. And she, and Ian, your husband, who is in television. And was. He is Canadian from British Columbia. He was working for the Journal, which was her show. So let me go on.
So Barbara Frum, who was Danielle's mother-in-law, really was an extraordinary woman, not just as the Walter Cronkite of Canada, who anchored Canada's flagship nightly news and public affairs show called The Journal, where my husband Ian was her senior producer, ultimately. But she was also a warm, brilliant, kind, generous woman.
Incredibly perceptive.
And incredibly perceptive. And so Ian and I first met when we were undergraduates together at Stanford.
Which is such a sweet story. He was like your first boyfriend.
Well, he was
almost.
Exactly
almost.
But he was my first serious boyfriend.
Right.
And he was a senior and I was a freshman. We met in our dormitory at Stanford. And, we went through a very long mostly long-distance relationship because of the age gap between us. You know, he graduated, he had to go on and get a job and move away, and I went on to do my thing. And so it was really 10 years of this long-distance, not entirely, but mostly long-distance relationship.
And he'd wanted to marry you early to say, and you were very pragmatic, and given your background, you were like,
I was also scared of marriage because of my parents' divorce.
Right.
Yeah.
And fearful of failure. So I wanted to be super certain that not only was this the right man, which I came to that conclusion earlier, but that I could actually be a competent partner in marriage, that I wasn't going to bring all of my baggage into a marriage and do to my kids what had happened to me. Mm-hmm. So Ian was very patient, and sort of we waited virtually 10 years before he proposed, and I accepted. And Barbara Frum, your mother-in-law, Ian's boss, was a very warm and strong proponent of our relationship. She really was a champion of our being together.
I also like how much she meddled. I totally identify with that.
Yes, because
like the fact that she knew about this and was invested in it.
She was all up in it. Yes.
She seems to be a little more enthusiastic about that marriage than your marriage, but we won't go there.
We're not going there.
Yep.
But it's only because it's her. Yeah, Ian was not her son.
Exactly.
So anyway, about 3 or 4 months before we were supposed to get married, just before we were to send out the invitations, I freaked out. We're living together in Toronto. He's working at the CBC. I'm working in a management consulting firm. And I just got terrified that I wasn't ready to get married. And I moved out of our shared house. I went into a very monastic apartment in downtown Toronto. And Ian, who was working for this show, The Journal, with Barbara, was sent on assignment for a month to South Africa. And so I lived by myself in this, while he was alone in South Africa, and we didn't communicate for the whole time he was away. I was trying to sort of figure out where my head was.
Well, you said imagine life without him.
Right.
What would that be like?
What would that be like? And weigh the pros and cons of that. And Barbara, as you know, had been diagnosed with cancer.
She had been, by the way, diagnosed with cancer for 19 years. And at the time, she was in her early 30s, and they said she had a year to live.
Oh, my God.
But then each year, she got another year. So she was always living as if which is, I think, a little relevant to her advice to you, because she was always living as if, I don't know if I'm going to see another summer, which you can imagine how that affects your outlook.
Yes. So, I get this. This is one story that I get choked up on. Sorry, but anyway,
bring it down.
So Ian is in South Africa. I'm alone in Toronto, and one morning, that happens to be the morning that Ian is getting ready to come back from South Africa to Canada. I wake up, as I always did, to the CBC morning news, and the lead story was that Barbara Frum had died, and I was just shaken and shocked, and I woke up crying. And I had this sort of epiphany, or as I describe it, a moment of being, where I realized that I needed to marry my husband, and that Barbara was right, and that
What did she say to you? What did she say? Do you remember what she said?
I don't remember her exact words, but what she just was certain that we were right for each other, and that we shouldn't miss this opportunity. And I do think your perspective on her sense that every minute counts, many ways drove her support for us. She was a huge champion of our relationship. And when she died, it just hit me that, I should stop screwing around, and not literally, but just figuratively, and
we'll get back to
commit.
that in a minute. Like, I want to know
commit to Ian. So the story is, I knew he was getting on a long flight from Johannesburg to Toronto, and I didn't want him to get off the airplane and see on the scroll on the TV that Barbara had died. And I also wanted him to know that I realized right then and there that I wanted to marry him. So I don't remember quite how I figured this out, but I managed to get him paged in the Johannesburg airport on one of those white courtesy
You
telephones.
could do that back in the day for a big emergency.
You could do it. No, my friend did it for a joke. He would page Franz Kafka. Is Mr. Franz Kafka in the United Airlines terminal? You could page in those days.
So he was paged. He came to the phone, and I'm kind of crying, and I say, honey, I've got two things I want to share with you. One, I really do want to marry you if you'll have me. And he said, yes, of course. And then I said, I want you also to know that Barbara's died, and I didn't want you to hear that when you got off the plane. And we had a moment of very, of tears together. He got on the plane, and I met him at Pearson Airport 18 hours later, and we've been together ever since.
I'm verklempt.
But I'm having an epiphany. Maybe we've got to introduce Jake to B.
Oh, Lord.
Okay, it happened here. That's Danielle's beautiful daughter. But who's drifting a little too liberal? Jake can they can set each other right. I'm just saying.
man.
Moving on.
Okay.
Okay,
He's home for
let's
Christmas.
don't listen to this. Well, I want to go back to
I'm
Ian
right.
because it's very important before you leave us. Like I want to talk about.
No, she can't.
No, but
leave us because I haven't asked about Madeline.
No, she's not. No, we're not. No.
And the world leaders.
Okay, we're not. Okay,
She met a lot of.
but I
want to
say one digression.
Okay.
Is what you were talking about with your son, Jake, and his politics was something that happened with Barbara and my husband, David, who she was, as you can appreciate having lived in Canada, just how crazy famous she was. But she was this figurehead of liberalism and the CBC establishment. And her son becomes, as you joke, this Alex B. Keaton. He becomes this Reaganite, outspoken, very smart, goes to Yale, starts penning all these columns about, that are...
Speechwriter for the White House.
He eventually becomes speechwriter at the White House. But at that time, it was also...
Axis of evil.
It was also... This was way before that. And people treated it, the public treated it as a kind of fun... The reality shows didn't exist, but isn't this funny? Look at Barbara from Sun completely rebelling against her, and then would try and make sort of untoward assumptions about, well, he must be paying her back for something, or
that's a very familiar.
Must be
analytic.
Rebellious, and here was the thing. That although it did worry his mother, she sounded like, I remember after we'd married, like in the first or second year, I sat on one of her sun chairs in her backyard and she started drilling me about David. Like, was he just this, economic, not caring of the people kind of wonky right winger who would throw the poor into the streets kind of thing. Like, and I was suddenly on the huge defense case for David.
But let's add, he married.
He did marry
and that was problematic.
A bit of a okay. We don't need to go. This is not about
Capulets and Montagues.
I want to go to Susan's point because I think this is
because her father.
Stop.
Okay.
I think we'll get to that another time.
Arch conservatives.
I think that what I sense is probably true of Jake and you, and what was very true. There was no tension really between David and his mother, in the sense that she completely respected his even then evident brilliance, and always talked to him about like people she was about, like if she was about to interview Margaret Thatcher, they were on the phone, but they never differed on values. And David would sometimes say, my parents are publicly politically liberal, but in their household, it's pretty socially conservative. I mean, they'd been married for over 30 years and, they were not bohemians or anything. And I suspect that whatever, not to psychoanalyze, but whatever Jake is going through, that
he's not going through anything.
No, okay,
he's sensible.
I'm just trying to characterize it as not a rebellion, because the values that you have given him.
Yes,
David used to say, children are deaf, but they see everything.
Yeah,
and that's probably more whatever he's doing, and very sincerely believe. Which David was not a show. It was not a show for him. He believed these things, even though they contradicted politically, but on the deep
The deep
foundations
values.
and
I
values.
agree
He
with
and
that.
his parents were completely at one. So that was anyway.
Yeah, no, there are some similarities. I mean, I think on fundamental, we fundamentally believe in the equality of all human beings. We believe in the value and the dignity of the individual. He takes it in an economically and socially conservative direction, and I take it in a progressive direction.
Which is
But at the-
exactly what David did.
But at the end of the day, we agree on more than we disagree on. Where we disagree now more than anything is, if we're in a, sober debate about, libertarianism or versus, conservatism versus liberalism, that's fine. It's when we get into the politics of the moment where things are so
Right.
crazy. And in my view,
Yeah.
forgive me if I'm offending anybody,
Okay.
but that the
I'm not a Trump supporter, so go for it.
And she's not easily.
And I'm a
triggered.
registered Democrat, just out of fear of my parents.
but that the Republican Party does not resemble the Republican Party that
No.
We all
certainly
knew.
of
and
80s.
yeah, well,
Really.
even of the mid 2000s.
Right.
But anyway, as he's my baby and I love him.
All right. So
I love him too, but I have a lot of
Okay,
questions.
so quick, you gotta fire them off because we didn't even
Okay,
get
so
to
she
gotta
was
hurt-
at the
yeah.
UN, and you had to deal with all of these world leaders, some good, some bad, some problematic. You had dance parties. God, I would love to have gone to those dance parties. She has dance parties. You had dance parties at the UN.
Hell yeah.
Well, what was that about?
That was about letting off steam, having fun, and
Did you get world leaders to dance?
Did you do?
no, I got a lot of UN ambassadors to dance.
No,
I didn't have
did you
world
dance
leaders.
with Putin?
No. But that guy is a lech.
Oh,
do tell. Okay.
Come
It's
on.
in the book.
I don't remember the
he-
Putin lech part.
Oh, he's
How did I miss
disgusting.
that?
He's
What did he
disgusting.
do?
In 2014, we were all in Normandy, France, to celebrate, the anniversary of D-Day, and it was one of these. We're in some French chateau, and it's the Queen of England, and it's the heads of state of all these countries, and it was each head of state only could have one person there with him. So I was President Obama's plus one as his national security advisor. But it's a large room and people are mixing and mingling. And I somehow found myself caught in conversation with the Russian national security advisor, who's somebody I didn't spend a lot of time with but knew and was trying to be civil with. And up walks Vladimir Putin. And he starts engaging in conversation. I'd met Putin before and since, but
He had his shirt on.
he had his shirt on. And he made a very crude comment about what a good-looking woman I was, especially for a national security advisor. And then he blew me a kiss physically, And I was just
You
like,
are welcome for my compliment.
yes. I'm like, of all the people that
There's
has
part
to
of me.
hit
There's
on
part
me
of me
in
that's
this
kind of
room.
like, okay.
You're short, you're ugly, you're bald.
Is he?
No.
But very powerful.
Is he unattractive? I mean, I can't even imagine.
He
how
is so totally not my type. But yeah, he's short, he's bald,
Yeah.
he's rude, but with a certain kind of Russian charm. But President Obama was like literally across the room, way out of eyesight, earshot. Couldn't do anything to help me out, defend my honor.
Punch
And
him.
so,
Had a duel.
so it was only later in the limousine with one of our colleagues where I had to tell him what went down. He was so pissed, but it was too late. That was one of the first of several subsequent
Well,
indignations.
you also, I was just going to say, I thought this book, too, given what you've been through and whether it's the racial stuff, the gender stuff, like you say, you didn't really have a lot of Me Too moments. I think it goes back to your original resilience and the way that your father taught you to view these things.
She's not easily triggered.
She's not easy. You're
Well,
not easily triggered.
It's not just triggered. I really
But
don't take shit. from
She doesn't
people.
take-
But you also,
from
you
Putin?
also,
You probably tried to think of some comeback.
No, I
You
just
also
with
take a
Putin-
lot of responsibility for things that happen to you in a way that is like, okay, I fucked up, and you say it, but you don't sort of go, well, that was because I was black. or
No.
that
I was
you're-
a woman.
I was a
and-
woman.
No, I mean, I try really hard to tell my story as honestly as I can, personal, professional. And I try to call balls and strikes on myself, recognizing that I'm not an entirely impartial umpire. But, there are policy issues and personal issues on which I acknowledge, I hope, relatively candidly that I made mistakes. And there are places where I'm very proud that I think I got it right. And I guess I'm at a stage in my life where I don't have any hesitation about being candid about who I am and where I've done well and where I've not done well.
Okay, so senator or president?
There you go.
Senator, yes, this is the last question.
Second to last, because I just,
Okay, no, second, last question. Senator or president? Are you running for?
I'm not running for anything right now.
you've got to.
I've got
we need- you know what? You have a moral obligation. I'm channeling your mother.
You're actually channeling my brother, but
Yeah.
maybe my mother. Look,
You're out of the adrenaline rush for now.
I'm out of it. And look, I've not ruled out running for office. I've not ruled out coming back in appointed capacity.
Or vice
I think
president.
the odds of that
Vice
are.
president.
I think the odds of my serving again are slim, but not none. And it depends on whether I think it's right in terms of what I can contribute and whether it's right for my family. What I did determine in the context of considering running for Senate in Maine was it wasn't the right time. With a daughter who's a junior in high school, who has put up for 8 years of her 17 years with a mother who was, either living in a different city or living in the same city and working crazy hours. This was not the time to either ask her to move with me to Maine, which is what
Which
would
you'd have
made
to
sense,
do, right?
or to separate myself from her. And so I don't mean to suggest that's the only consideration, but that was really the primary consideration. It just wasn't the
Are you
right
enjoying this break from
so totally enjoying my freedom. Here we are, right?
having red wine?
Drinking red wine, and I'm one of the great blessings of having had the privilege to serve and getting to serve at the highest levels with presidents I respect and colleagues I love, is that, I don't feel unfulfilled. I don't feel like I've got to do X, Y, or Z. And so whatever comes next is going to be because I want to do it. And the best thing that I've been able to say since leaving government is I don't do anything I don't want to do. If somebody asks me to speak here or go there, or if I don't want to do it, I say no.
Yeah.
And I want that freedom. And it's been the greatest thing since leaving government. I love serving. I wouldn't trade it for anything, even after, all the tracks on my back. I loved it, and it was a huge privilege. And I encourage anybody who's interested in public service to give themselves to that, even if only for a small portion of their career. And if it made sense to go back, I would. But right now, I don't feel any compulsion to do that. And it's hugely liberating not to feel like I got to do this, I got to do that, I got to prove this.
Yeah.
Well, I urge everyone to read her book, Tough Love, and then you will feel like me. I have a compulsion to get her back into public office.
I know. You really
She's
do.
a
And also
natural
like
leader,
9,000 other questions
stoic,
that we didn't ask.
It isn't like subject to this tyranny of Twitter and all, because she's been through it.
Right.
And oh boy, I'd love to have you on that stage with the debaters.
Yes.
Wow. Well,
Yeah,
thank
we
you.
would've.
That's very,
All right. Well, there's still
very
time.
kind of you.
She's young.
I'm not too old.
You're
yet.
young.
Not too old, especially in this race. You have a good 30 years
As a kid.
20
All
anyway.
right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you guys. This was so much fun.
Okay, well, I told you I'm smitten.
I've got these notes in front of me, and I'm just looking
Well,
at.
those are like the notes that I had for Very Bad
No,
Wizard.
they're not. They're actual notes that are, I understand. Okay, so here are questions we didn't get to. We never got to talk to her about the toll. I mean, just what she did as just an uber working woman that I really wanted, I guess I would have wanted to hear more about how it affected her family, about Ian. I mean, he really had to pretty much suspend his career. He did eventually move his career to D.C., but he really did pick up on the home front, especially while she was at the UN, because she would leave Monday morning and come back Friday.
Live in New York.
No, she'd come back on weekends. So, so I always just want to unpack how you did that and how it worked, because...
And I wanted to know about the foreign leaders, like the best in the world.
She loved Sharon. Apparently he was a flirt. She accepted his flirting, but not Putin's.
Although she admitted that Putin had a certain dictator
charm,
charisma,
as it were, charisma. She also wrote. And then the other thing she had seen, she wrote about going to Rwanda after the massacre and getting off a plane and
actually seeing bodies,
stepping. I mean, it was like a scene. It was like something out of World War I or II, World War I, and being in a trench, and the massacres. The other thing we didn't get to ask her is just, he's not just some policy wonk sitting in an office or a bureaucrat. Like, she was really out through Africa, seeing, horrific things, including the aftermath of certain policies. So she had this sense that, policy was not abstract to her. The other thing I'd wanted to ask her was about when you read about how a lot of decisions were made while she, in her assorted roles, some of it seemed, okay, maybe this was getting really bureaucratic. How do we, if we deal with, Nigeria and we do this or that. But on the other hand, compared to how diplomacy is being conducted today, so we just fired the State Department and just come to me personally.
When the administration came in, they prepared elaborate.
I know. That's all. Just send Giuliani.
Said whatever. And now it's
speak to my personal lawyer.
So but also, what was so amazing about her is that it's just like a real person that you can relate to, who's complicated and sensitive and educated, and in this crazy kind of storm of politics where you go from crisis to crisis, and just hearing about how she dealt with it, and she's so honest. I mean, I just can't believe how honest this book is, because usually people that come out of an administration, they just write bromides and...
Well, also they are always covering their ass too.
Yeah.
That's the other thing I liked about this book is and we sort of touched on this, is that when she made a mistake, she owned up to it.
Yeah.
And she talked about that especially when she was younger, being perceived as too brash and too knowledgeable and too impatient with people. And one of her mentors had to pull her aside and say, you can't do this. And she listened. And
one of the things we couldn't get into was she was very close to Madeleine Albright.
Yeah, they're like a family friend growing up.
A surrogate mother.
Right.
Madeleine Albright, I've never known much about, but I watched an interview between Madeleine Albright and Susan Rice, and it was so funny. Madeleine Albright described coming to this country from Czechoslovakia and had an accent, but she wanted to fit in, and she tried desperately. She said that her mother, when her friends would come over, would try to read their fortune. And her father would go fishing, because everybody fished wherever town they were living in, and he wanted to fit in, but he'd wear a suit and a tie and go fishing like in Czechoslovakia, and I guess that's what they did. And you could just see the rapport between them and how amused and
well, in Susan's case, the mother was incredibly. I mean, she also writes about the battles they had in childhood, as you can understand given the history. But her mother turning out to be, she an adult reconciling and then learning that her mother had very, very shrewd advice, which we mothers always like to.
And the message of her book, and here is listen to your mother, but I also think people should listen to Jake.
I hope Jake is listening to this podcast, because he would feel
vindicated.
Vindicated and boosted.
But you know what I love? I love that she kind of understands that.
Yeah.
that he's reached different conclusions. And that's what happens is not all, but most people who are conservative or libertarian, it's not that they have terrible values. They have good values. They've just led them to different conclusions, and that could be debated.
I didn't want to say this to her, but when I was talking about David and his mother, but in some ways, Jake is probably very much being what his mother was. Is that he's figuring out where he sees the problem,
and boldly stating it,
and is trying to fix it. Like if the problem is we can't talk about these issues honestly the way we were, he's going to be a bit of a bulldozer maybe.
Yeah.
And that's where he and his mother don't disagree. So
and aren't very different.
And aren't very different. And isn't
the apple doesn't fall
the
far
apple
from
doesn't
the
fall
tree.
from the tree. Anyway. All right. Well, that was fabulous. It's been a great season. It's been a great year. We're going to take a little break till, I don't know, we'll come back like the first or second week of January. I have to look at the calendar, but
fabulous guests and
fabulous guests lined up. We are very, as always, grateful to our patrons. We wish everybody a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays and Happy Hanukkah, but especially our patrons. I would say we are up. I checked the figures. We're up to half funding our podcast. So let's do one of those end of the year pushes.
Well, just please support Femsplain Nation. Because
we're not yet a nation. We want to be.
We want to be a nation. If we had Susan at the helm, we would be a nation. But she kind of represents what we try to do here, which is reasonable and human and understanding, but opinionated.
Well, we are grateful. So if you can help out at patreon.com/femsplainers, we'd be very grateful. And if you did, right after this, we're going to record first of all, our monthly last call, where we answer all your questions and talk about.
Can I get to my rant yet?
And then for our weekly rant, which Christina is hugely popular. For some reason, people are really happy to hear you
really
sound off.
Subscribe, because if you don't subscribe, you won't hear it. But I'm going to go after a mob at NYU that it went after a professor. It's a complicated case,
and she's been putting back the wine with Susan Rice, so she is ready to go.
This is the final thing I'll say. I love Susan because
you're still in love with her.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you texted me that.
I'm in love with you, but now you have a rival.
Anyway, have a thank you for being with us this year, this season. Ella is here in the studio, quiet as always.
Quiet as a church mouse.
I'm just wondering if Christina loves me too.
Love doesn't even begin to convey the complexity and depth of positive emotions.
And Ella is converting to becoming a sad Jew.
Yeah. No, she's going to be a happy Jew. She's going to be like the happiest millennial or iGen or what. I mean, she will have a marriage. She will have children. She will have a community.
We need to talk about your conversion process. But yes, Ella is converting to Judaism, so she will also join us in the CBS ghetto at Hanukkah.
Chinese food.
Are you doing anything for your Hanukkah?
So I'm still celebrating Christmas with my family.
This is the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Honestly. That's what my kids had.
So no more church and no, prayers or anything like that. But, still giving gifts that are Hanukkah gifts, but they're wrapped,
Getting kind of the best part.
Yeah. Yeah.
The gift part. Let's admit, people, it's the spirit of Christmas. Can we just say that?
What?
Gift giving and turkey and all that fun. And
all right.
Although now that I only eat kosher meat, I have to break it to my grandpa that I can't eat his sauerbraten that he cooks every year.
Oh,
so we'll see how that goes.
I think God would be on the side to eat your.
No, don't listen to her.
I think he would.
That's the shiksa speaking.
Ella's a shiksa.
No, she's a serious convert.
Well, I was a serious convert. I
meant to be I was already.
Look,
Jewish,
this is really kind of.
We're going too far.
You're the one who's
I'm the
bad shiksa.
Yeah. I'm totally shiksa and totally Jewish. So take your pick, kids.
We get both. But anyway, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa,
Festivus,
Happy
man. Festivus.
Festivus. And we'll see you in the new year, and thank you all. Hey, thanks for listening to the Femsplainers. Keep up with us on Twitter and Facebook at Femsplainers and on Instagram at Femsplainers Podcast. Send questions and comments to contact@femsplainers.com.
A big thanks to Ella Ryder, our research and in-studio production assistant, and to Nat Frum, our audio and video editor. And we're proud to be part of the Ricochet Network and grateful to the American Enterprise Institute for allowing us to record in its studio every week in downtown Washington, D.C.
And miss something? You'll find everything you need at our homepage, femsplainers.com, including links to past episodes, our sponsors, where you can sign up to support us, and even to merch. And please don't forget to like us or give us 5 stars on iTunes.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.